Heading into week 9 of the fantasy football season, here's a few quarterbacks I've looked at on the wire this week. The first guy, Jimmy Garoppolo of the San Francisco 49ers. So Jimmy G, he's been back from injury the last 2 weeks, and he's played pretty decent football, is Garoppolo. Week 7, I know it was a rain game versus Indianapolis. 181 passing yards, a touchdown, 2 windows, and a fumble loss. And then week 8 at Chicago, he went off with a huge game. 322 passing yards, 4 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, and a 2-point conversion. So week 9, I know it's an NFC West matchup versus division rival Arizona Cardinals here that give up the 28th least amount of fantasy points to quarterbacks. But I think in that game, San Francisco, they could be competitive in that one. And Jimmy G can make a few plays for this team in that game. And right now, he's available in 90% of fantasy leagues. So with injuries and buys in 2 quarterback leagues, I don't think he's the worst ad in the world. The second quarterback's Ben Roethlisberger of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So Big Ben, he played a mediocre game in week 8 at the Cleveland Browns. He had 266 passing yards and a touchdown in this one. So right here, Big Ben, the last couple weeks, his stats have improved. He's still not getting the huge fantasy days, but he's not hurting you as well, scoring anywhere from 17 to 20 fantasy points. Week 5 versus Denver, 253 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, a fumble loss. Week 6 versus Seattle, 229 passing yards, a touchdown, and a fumble loss. And then, like I mentioned before, at Cleveland in week 8, 266 pass yards and a touchdown. So right here, week 9, he's got a pretty decent matchup versus the Chicago Bears that I mentioned earlier, that Jimmy Garoppolo ripped them up for a good ball game. And I think Big Ben could have a good game. It's a Monday night game. Pittsburgh's at home. They're rolling now, winning 3 ball games in a row. And Big Ben, he's available in 79% of fantasy leagues. And I think he could have a good ball game. Right here, I know he's still not in sync with his receivers like you would want to see him. Claypool's had it down here. Johnson, he's been in and out of the lineup. But Big Ben, each and every week, it seems like he's getting a little bit better. And I think next week versus Chicago, he's a decent option. The next quarterback's Mike White of the New York Jets. So Zach Wilson, he's going to be out for at least 2 to 4 weeks here for this Jet team. And Mike White, he was the first Jet quarterback since Vinny Testaverde in the 2000 season to go over 400 yards. He had a huge ball game versus a pretty decent Cincinnati Bengal team in week 8. 405 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. And he also added a 2-point conversion. So right here, he had a huge ball game versus the Cincinnati Bengals. And next week, it's a pretty decent matchup for Mike White and this Jet team at the Indianapolis Colts that give up the 9th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. So right now, Mike White, he's available in 99% of fantasy leagues. And he's more of an ad in the deepest of leagues. Obviously, a 2-quarterback league or 16, 20-team league, something along those lines. But, hey, you got to give him credit. He went out there, he performed, he kept his team in the game. And the Jets made a few plays at the end of that ball game to win it. And Mike White, he looked pretty decent and poised in that one. And he got everyone involved in that game. The 4th quarterback I looked at this week on the Warriors, Carson Wentz of the Indianapolis Colts. So Carson Wentz, he's been pretty decent for fantasy owners this season here. Now 3 games in a row with 20 or more fantasy points. Week 6 versus Houston, 223 passing yards, 2 touchdowns. Week 7 at the 49ers, 150 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 23 rush yards, a rushing touchdown, and a fumble loss. And week 8 versus the Titans, 231 in the air, 3 touchdowns, 2 windows, and 11 rushing yards. And next week, he's got a good matchup versus the New York Jets that, let's be honest, they don't really stop anybody on the defensive end of things. And right here, I think Carson Wentz could have another good game this week in week 9 versus the New York Jets. And he's still available in a light amount of fantasy leagues, only at 44%, but he's still worth an ad, in my opinion. And the 5th and final quarterback I looked at this week's Trevor Siemian of the New Orleans Saints. So Trevor Siemian, he came in for Jameis Winston. And hey, they beat the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in week 8, 159 passing yards, a touchdown, and 2 rushing yards in that one. So Siemian, he looked pretty decent in my opinion. Obviously, he wasn't that accurate, and he missed a few throws. But right here, that injury to Jameis Winston, we need to know more news on him. But in my opinion, it didn't look good. He had to get helped off to the sidelines and then eventually carted off to the locker room. And the way his knee got stuck in the turf and twisted off that horse collar tackle, in my opinion, he probably tore the ACL or something. So Siemian here, he's going to be the quarterback right now, unless Taysom Hill comes back. And we saw Hill last season fill in when Drew Brees went down with injury, and he had some decent fantasy days. But right now, Taysom Hill, we don't know when he's going to come back. He was out in this game, obviously, with still the bad concussion. But we'll see this week, in week 9, if it's going to be Hill or Siemian, if Hill's cleared. But right now, Siemian's more of obviously a traditional quarterback. He stays in the pocket. And a few seasons ago, we saw some good games from him 3 or 4 seasons ago on Denver. So maybe he'll find something in a Sean Payton type of offense. So that's a few quarterbacks I looked at on waivers in week 9 of the fantasy football season.